Okay, we're going to go ahead and finish up the series that Extra Credits has done on paper money, and we're going to do a critical look here at it. If you saw my first video on paper money, going over what they did, I was pretty nonplussed about the fact that they were accurately describing some of the negative effects that having a commodity currency could potentially have, while ignoring the instances where the what we have now in terms of paper currency or electronic currency actually has those problems way worse. And they didn't seem to mention that at all, which led to the question of why. So we're going to go ahead and watch the rest of the series here and do a similar kind of breakdown of what their arguments are here.
Little truth to the idea that Marco Polo brought pasta to Italy from the East. There's another marvel that the book about his travels popularized. It was an idea, a radical one, which is perhaps best summarized by the very title of the chapter that discusses it. For in the Book of the Marvels of the World, or as we know it, The Travels of Marco Polo, there's a chapter titled, How the Great Khan Caused the Bark of Trees, Made into Something Like Paper, to Pass for Money Throughout His Realm. In ancient China, they invented a coinage system where the coins had holes punched in them. So if you needed to measure out large denominations, you could just run a string through the center of the coins, and a particular length of string would hold 100 or 1,000 at once. But over time, the economy evolved, transactions got bigger, and merchants found themselves needing tens or hundreds of thousands of coins to complete transactions. And of course, a strand of 1,000 of these weighed about 10 pounds already, so it became a real pain in the neck to transport them. So the government started saying, how about we pay you pieces of paper that have the amount of coins we owe you written on them, and you can come pick up your coins at the capital whenever you want your money.
Okay, I'm going to interject here first because they didn't really specify in this instance whether the coins were base metal coins or actual precious metals, because the idea that you would have trouble um, creating a transaction due to the weight of gold and silver. I covered this last time, and it just seemed ridiculous. Remember last time I mentioned that in the medieval period, the average laborer made 6 pounds of silver per year. So basically, if you had 6 pounds of silver, which you could probably hold in one hand, if you can hold a small dumbbell, represented a whole year's worth of wages for a single person. And an average single person at that, not a very wealthy person. Furthermore, you could go further again, and if you needed to, say, travel long distances where weight was a very large concern, you could convert that silver into gold, in which case you would be carrying 1/16 of that weight historically. So you would have to be creating some real radical sizes of transactions to ever have a problem with weight. So what I think they've done here, China was actually one of the earliest societies to go to not paper currency, but what they did is they used base metals. They used copper and lead and just tried to keep track of the value. And in those cases, if you're trying to use copper or lead coins, which they did as I believe it was like 1035 was the earliest instance of trying to use a base metal currency, then yeah, you could have a real problem with the weight of your currency and the value of your goods, because you would need tremendous, like with copper, you're talking like 100 times more than silver necessary in order to do the same sort of transactions that we were talking about previously. So yes, and it's only worse if you go to lead. So yeah, only because China had had this experiment with base metal, which is basically paper money. It's not a precious metal anymore. It's a common metal. It's not very difficult. It would have been considered basically in the past if you had mined gold or silver and gone through the appropriate channels and had that turned into coinage, you would have gotten there would have been no problem with that methodology. However, if you had just mined some gold, some copper or some lead, and said, "Hey, I want to turn this copper or lead into some coins," the Chinese government would have shot you down because it's not the material itself that they were using; it was the government sanction of blessing the material with their mark that gave the copper or the lead its value. And as that blessing became more and more common, it became worth less and less, in which is a very similar system as we have today. So let's keep going and see what else they have to say.
And since the government bought a lot of things, these paper slips started being circulated everywhere. Soon, merchants realized that these slips of paper were always good, that they could be turned in at the capital for however much was written on them whenever they wanted.
Always seems like a strong word, because I think, as we know, as history shows, inevitably these guys start issuing more of these slips than there is of the gold or whatever else is backing it, which is the basis for fractional reserve system, which is your traditional bank run, like It's a Wonderful Life. Go look it up if you haven't seen what a bank run is. It's an old movie. Go ahead.
So heck, why even go to the trouble of turning them in? Why not just trade the slips of paper to other merchants for their goods? Thus, the merchants began using these promissory notes, or essentially government IOUs, as money. And then the government caught on and simply started printing up money. So by
Yeah, did they have any backing for that, or were they causing massive inflation while doing that? Let's go.
the time we got the travels of Marco Polo, paper money was widespread, and this idea started to catch on even outside of China. Sometimes with little success, like when Gekatu, the corrupt Ikan of the Middle East, tried to introduce paper money after he'd already splurged the royal money, and had his economy collapse to a cow plague. He
Okay, so yeah, here's like the negative. Let's see if they are honest about it.
basically fell prey to the misconception that simply printing money was literally a way to print money. Needless to say, he was promptly strangled with a bowstring. But
Yay, let's strangle our current leaders with a bowstring. That would be the appropriate response if they've done the same thing, right? Let's keep going.
sometimes, in other places, the idea started to take stronger hold, especially Italy. The Italian city-states had already been playing with this idea a little. They were the economic dynamos of Europe, and the first truly great trading cities on the continent since the ancient world. They were also basically always at war. This made carrying around great heaping piles of cash a wee bit of a danger. So the merchants came up with a new system, influenced by the tales from China. At first, they began simply issuing promissory notes, basically IOUs. Merchants would get to a new town and stock up on supplies and trade goods, but rather than carrying the cash to pay for them across dangerous country, they would just give the seller an IOU, often backed by a very famous or wealthy merchant.
Again, this is something that was covered in the first one, but banditry? Guys, I mean, I understand that the money is the most concentrated form of wealth, but we're talking about bandits, pirates. Do the background work. When pirates took over a ship, they were like logging each barrel of molasses that they stole from people. Yeah, you might be reducing your risk with this, but if you have a big bandit problem, they're going to steal your goods just as easily as they're going to steal your currency. Continue.
Promising to pay for the goods at a later date. But here's the trick. To keep anybody from having to haul all that money around, the merchant wouldn't ever actually end up paying the seller directly. Instead, he would just pay a bank in his hometown. Here's how it would work. The merchant selling the goods would take the promissory note he got for them to his local bank, which he had access to, unlike most of Europe, because the Crusades had accidentally created modern banking. Why let a little crusade get in the way of a good story about fiscal instruments? So, he would take the note down to the bank and cash it in for slightly less than its face value. Basically, the bank was buying the note from him for some amount less than it was worth. Then the bank, which would have branches in other cities, would send a rider with a stack of these notes out to whatever specific city those notes had originally come from. When the rider got to the city, he would hand them to the local branch of the bank, and then the local branch would go collect from the merchant who had bought the goods. So the merchant could pay for goods in a far-off location by paying his local bank after the fact. A pretty huge step forward for commerce.
And there's really not a problem with this system until the bank itself or one of the people involved in the process perverts the system by creating more IOUs than the underlying money, which they just alluded to in the previous section where the leader just started mass producing paper currency. Let's keep going.
But what if the bank didn't have a branch in the merchant's hometown? Well, then the bank would just sell the promissory note to another bank that did have one there. So these promissory notes sort of started to take on a value of their own. People started trading these notes, and soon the banks got in on the action and just let you take out notes from the bank itself if you had the deposits to cover it. But this didn't reach its full form for quite some time. Fast forward about 300 years and move halfway across the continent to the little island hanging off of Italy's side. The year is 1640. The never popular Charles I's monarchy is deeply in debt. He had gotten into a tiff with the Parliament and basically disbanded it for over a decade. But, according to English law, Parliament is the only group allowed to levy taxes, which you do need when you're a king and flat broke. But not Charles. No. He had all sorts of crazy schemes for bringing in money without calling on Parliament. So miffed he was at them. And in 1640 we have one fine example. He just seized all the money in the mint. And this is kind of a big deal because it wasn't his money in the mint. All the merchants and the goldsmiths of London deposited their hard currency at the...
Okay, I'm just gonna pause a second here and ask, why is extra history being an apologist for a tyrannical ruler? I mean, he's about to explain a process by which a tyrannical ruler stole money from people. So let's see what their moral justification for this action is.
Just as a place to store it. So the king just picked up all that cash and declared it to be another one of his ever-popular forced loans. And then he proceeded to also seize all of the East India Company's pepper, just to add a strange, if somewhat delectable twist to this tale. Needless to say, his head was promptly separated from his body, which leads...
Hooray. Okay, so this is the second ruler that we've had in this video that has been summarily executed for crimes against humanity, essentially, by stealing the money of, or debasing or stealing the money, which is basically the same thing, of the common people of the country. So it's not looking very good for the system when you routinely are having to execute your head of state for what is essentially a crime against humanity. Let's keep going.
Leaves us in the aftermath with a bunch of merchants and goldsmiths. The merchants and goldsmiths got together, and the goldsmiths basically said, look, we have these giant vaults for storing all of our gold. If you want to pay us a small amount, you can rent a corner of the vault to put all of your money in. This rapidly evolved to the goldsmiths paying people small amounts of interest to leave their money with them in exchange for the right to lend it out. This basically made them into banks. And in their capacity as banks, when people would deposit their money, the goldsmiths would basically give the depositor a receipt, which they could turn back in to claim their money. But soon, these goldsmiths made a pivotal switch. They changed from making out receipts, which could only be redeemed by the person who originally made the deposit, to also offering receipts that could be redeemed by whomever held them. This allowed people to start using their receipts as currency. Rather than pay for something with a pile of coins, why not just put that pile of coins in the bank and pay for stuff with these far more convenient receipts? Of course, as soon as they started doing this, people began to ask for multiple receipts in small, regular denominations. So you'd go to the bank, you'd drop off 20 quid, and ask the nice fellow at the register to give you 20 receipts for £1 apiece, so that you could go out and buy some vegetables or something.
And not really a problem with this until Mr. Bankerman decides to print more receipts than the actual gold in the bank.
With them. As soon as you do that, you basically have the banknote, the fundamental form of paper money. And the goldsmiths were clever folk. They started to notice the funny thing about banknotes. These banknotes were starting to get passed around from hand to hand without often getting handed back in at the bank, which meant that the bankers could keep playing around with the money those notes were supposed to represent even as they circulated through the markets.
Uh-oh. Yeah, foreshadowing. Here we go. And I don't see how they end up portraying this as a positive, so let's keep going.
After all, so long as everybody doesn't try to turn in their banknotes at once, the bank can lend more money than it actually has in its vaults. While one banknote is circulating its way from hand to hand, the bank can use the coins that note represents to cover somebody else turning their banknote in. And thus, fractional reserve banking was born,
Kill it! Kill it!
expanding the money supply of England, but not without introducing some dangers. Join us next time as we move from these Wild West beginnings to the even wilder West personas that attempted to make paper money official.
Okay, so that wasn't very conclusive. They were just kind of laying out what the what I didn't see them in the first one. They made a definitive stand in the first episode they did, where they made gold and silver seem like it was primitive and backwards and had all these problems, and the paper currency does not have these problems. And in this one, they were just kind of honest about the problems, and they weren't so much trying to portray it as a good thing necessarily. So maybe we're going to have to wait until the next section for the punchline. So let's go ahead and I'm going to end this video here, and then we're going to see another part 3 and see how they justify the claims they made in the first one with all the negatives of the paper currency that they portrayed in the second one. Hope this was useful to you guys, and I will see you in the next video.